Oh my God, you haven't? So. Class is starting. I'll tell you.
Oh, that's right now.
All right, good morning. Did everyone have a good weekend? Football was back. It was so nice to have football back. My family was thrilled, of course, but I was very excited to have football back, even though I don't think I actually watched much of it. It was just nice that it was there. I was so excited. And I won both of my soccer games on Saturday with my little ones. Like, I don't know how that happened, but we won. Like, there was tears. There were lots of tears for my little team, but we still managed to like pull off a victory. And then 8-1 for my older team. It was like, we crushed them. I've never scored so many goals after 3. I was like, what are we doing? I'd lost every game last year. So it was so exciting to win one. I was like, I don't know what this feels like. Beside myself excited. So anyway, otherwise the weekend felt like it went quick. I don't know if anyone else feels that way, but I feel like it just like was over so fast. But back at it, we are looking at our schedule. And we have our first exam coming up in a little bit. So it's a week from Wednesday. So I'm going to talk about that soon. But again, just to make sure that is kind of on your mind. And then we get to start female anatomy today, and then we'll do male anatomy afterward. And I'm still fighting like the end of this like awful like sinus infection that I've had for like a week. So forgive me. I'm in that like awful, like annoying coughing stage of it. And you can't cough now. It's like a COVID thing. Like ever since COVID, if you cough, everyone glares at you. So I just feel like I'm trying not to cough. So if I do, don't glare at me. It's not contagious. It's like an awful sinus infection. Seem to get them way more than I would prefer to. But I had another thought. Maybe not. Okay, so we're gonna go into chapter 5 today. And I want to start it with an activity that we're gonna do together in groups. And traditionally, I tend to think this is kind of fun. We'll see if you agree when we're done. But I want you to get into groups of like 3 to 4 people. So just maybe 3, 4 at the most. But find a group. You're going to spend a little bit of time together, but I'll give you just a minute to form a group. So like 3 would be ideal. 3 or 4. Find a couple of people real quick.
I know.
Maybe to merge over a little.
If you want to, sure.
Got it? Everybody. All right, so I want you to, in a second here, you're going to send one person up from your group. Each group, you need a big piece of paper. Grab a couple of different black markers, and then you need one of these little pieces of paper as well. So 3 things, this, and some markers. And if you could make sure your books or notes or like anything is closed for a couple of minutes. But send someone up and then I will tell you what we're doing from there.
Can you handle that? You know,
I think it can carry.
You've got this. I have faith. You can grab a couple just in case they're dead or. Right. Take a minute and write all of your first and last names on there somewhere. Try to keep it off the like main part, so maybe like up in the corner or on the back, but your first and last names, you are turning this into me for credit today. So just take a minute, write all your names on there.
I have not. Over here getting good.
yes.
So let me construction. All right, so as a group, you're gonna be working on something together. If you have your little card and we've looked at it, what you're gonna be doing is you're gonna be drawing some pictures for me on this big piece of paper. And we're gonna tape them up when we're done, right? I'll put them up over here. Just so you can stare at me. Give me like. I'll explain. Ready?
Yeah.
Thank you. So you can draw one picture. You can draw two pictures, whatever makes sense to you. And you can start with pencil and then go over it with your thick black markers, or if you're confident, black marker, right? But I want you to draw images and label all of the things that are on here. Now, if you have no idea where or what that is, that's okay. We're gonna talk about it. Feel free to be creative. I have seen some very funny portrayals of a few things on here that people typically don't know what they are. I'll tell them to you afterward, but I'm gonna give you like a good 10 minutes as a group. Draw these things, label them, and then we'll go from there.
The one.
Don't look at that.
I don't like. Next to the list. Yeah.
I'm gonna get it run.
And what's the language? Which one? Oh, I'm not. I just want that for my We can do some business, that's the. Next.
So we got it there. Got it there. I feel like doubting, but. Yeah. Think about. You are one to know, I have to. Maybe. He's already done it. Stop it.
Maybe.
Services the bottom. No, that's that is not correct. Some of it is, so that's the outer limits. Yeah. No, it is. Yes.
Pretty close.
Oh, wait. Yeah, but it's nice at the. It's like up in there. It's so good. You're right. No, so then you see what, like, yeah. Yeah. You know what?
So.
Like this. I don't love you, Majora. This love you. I just don't like. It's just like I just don't know.
I really thought.
Where?
Let's try in about 5 minutes, okay? 5 minutes.
I'll turn you.
What if the Chimera side? What are you going to?
Yeah.
I think it's.
Draw back.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Oh, no. FBI. Oh, good. Thank you, guys. Alright, so we already fucked up from the external. Okay. Back up. Yeah. I thought that was, but I didn't.
Just a few more.
We're just keeping. You know, oh, yeah. It's so good. That's big news. It doesn't say me. Oh, I'm right. Like those kids that would be testing, right? She got like. Oh, no worries.
Yeah.
I mean, that goes high.
Oh my God. I am.
You gotta represent.
Yeah,
Yeah, there are other.
I'm ready to post.
I counted as a photo, but this is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just that.
Overthinking.
So just wanted to try to start wrapping up.
I know that.
Perfectionist.
No.
It's like an eyebrow.
Are you done? You have that look of like, one way or the other. You put it on there. Oh, yeah. We'll be right on.
I would be pretty statue. Nice. Oh, it's all. I mean. Don't make that a tattoo. Alright.
Yeah, we don't.
I can see you know a little bit of something. Something like competition. Get out of here. Gonna be in the middle of fire.
Done here. With the teeth.
Never know.
Yeah.
All right.
Wow.
Yeah, that's the best one. That's the best one. That's still trying to figure out what you're watching the car. My God.
Yeah.
Don't dare that. Wait.
Alright, so I have one. What? All right.
Okay.
So I have All right. Look at beautiful anatomy up there, right? So I can tell you that historically, so I've done this a few times, right? Historically, there's a few that give people a hard time. The Mons Veneris, right, which a lot of people like, right? And the perineum, right? And so we'll talk about both of those, but I love this. I love it. They're all pretty, very nicely done, right? I love it. Like I said, I left them up once. I thought it would be good for the next class to learn something. And then I got this like phone call halfway through the day and it was like, could you not leave anatomy pictures up in the classroom? So I'm tempted to leave them up again just because the next class is mine. So, but I don't know.
What's the next class?
Abnormal psych. So yeah, I mean, why not, right? Could be fun. But thank you. Hopefully that gave you kind of a fun chance. A lot of you did 2 drawings. We're going to talk about all these structures. But as a funny side note, I have seen the USS Mons Veneris before. People drew like a spaceship like version of it. We had Count Mons Veneris, right? Like a little vampire. And then I had somebody do Veneris Targaryen once as well. Like people who just didn't know where those structures were. So we'll talk about that. I'll show you some images. Really important as we go through this, right? We don't tend to use the proper terms for anatomy, hardly ever. That's what we're going to focus on and learn. We'll also look a little bit at slang because we do tend to use a lot of slang for female and male anatomy. But let's look at some of these structures here, starting with external and then working our way to internal structures. And then we'll do the same for male anatomy when we get there. So you can see the Mons Veneris up at the top, right? If you were wondering where that is. And the perineum down at the bottom. We'll talk about both, but if you were wondering where they were, now you know. So the external structures of female anatomy, we collectively call the vulva, right? So vulva and vagina being different things. Vulva refers to like all of the external genitals of a woman, right? So we'll say external. And I'm just gonna write like a key word or two for each one of them up here, and they're defined really well in your book as well, but we'll just kind of talk about each one of them. So when we talk about the vulva, we're talking about all the external genitalia of the female, including the mons veneris, the labia, the clitoris, the urinary and vaginal openings, which we'll talk about as well. Again, not the same as the vagina, which is an internal structure, which we'll get to in a few minutes. The vulva, the appearance of the vulva varies from woman to woman, all right? That we interview gynecologists all the time who will say no two look alike. I have some images for you. This was a dangerous Google search, I have to tell you, right? Like, don't type that in Google. Like, I'm expecting to get a phone call from the district any day. That's like, what were you searching in your office, right? Anyway, but again, appearance varying from woman to woman in terms of hair and color, size of the labia, right? All sorts of different things that are very different from person to person, right? So there isn't like one standard appearance. We'll talk about each one of these structures if I go back here. So vulva, we wrote up here, is all the external genitals and like genitalia of females. The mons veneris, what that means is mound of Venus. That's what mons veneris translates to. It is like which is named after the Roman goddess of love and beauty, right? Interesting thing, Venus, right, is her name. But this area is in charge of like cushioning and protecting the pubic bone. So the male and female like reproductive systems are designed for procreation, right? That's the way our bodies are naturally designed to reproduce, to have children. So assuming that we are having intercourse for the purposes of having a baby, right? The mons veneris is like a very fatty mound of tissue that protects the pubic bone during any kind of intercourse, right? From like any kind of bruising, right, that could occur, right? And then the hair might be there or might not, right? That would be an area that would traditionally be covered in hair, again, with the protection and cushioning like intent. The labia are the lips, sometimes referred to, the labia majora and labia minora. And so the labia majora are the outer, bigger lips, and the labia minora are the smaller inner lips, right, of the vulva, of the vagina. What these both have, this one has the same here, the cushioning and protection. The labia minora, though, a little bit different, contains an incredible amount of like sweat and oil glands and nerve endings. So it's got blood vessels, nerve endings, and sweat and oil glands. The labia minora, or the like thinner inner lips, right, play a really big role in arousal, right? When a woman becomes aroused, right, all of the blood vessels and sweat and oil glands here, right, kind of engorged with blood, right, which allows for lubrication to occur. Again, can be very different from woman to woman. They're not always kind of equivalent to each other. Some might have one might be bigger than the other or a little bit longer than the other, right? A lot of variety in the appearance of these here, but cushioning and protection, and then more like arousal and lubrication as part of like any kind of like sexual intercourse or activity of any kind. The clitoris has one main function to it, and that's pleasure. It is a dense ball of nerve endings, right, with one function only, and that's really pleasure. And we talked about this in the couple of documentaries we watched. This was a part of female anatomy that not a lot of people knew anything about, right? They joked that it was like a statue in Greece that they visited once, right? This was something that was ignored for a very, very long time, thinking that a woman could only reach orgasm through like penetration or traditional intercourse, when a lot of pleasure does come from this one region, right? That's its only function. The urethra is where urine passes from the bladder. Right, so a small opening in which urine passes through from the bladder. The hymen, right? Anyone know what the slang term for hymen is? What do we typically call this in like a slang term? Anyone know? Cherry, right? So if anyone ever says like you popped somebody's cherry, you're talking traditionally about the hymen It's a small little flap of skin that covers the vaginal opening. Traditionally, when a woman has intercourse for the first time, this tiny little flap of skin gets ruptured. And so sometimes people bleed a tiny bit, just a little bit, when they have intercourse for the first time. And so the slang term of like popping the cherry comes from that. Interesting, this has a lot of historical significance. We used to try to check to see if somebody was a virgin by seeing if their hymen was intact. Now, that's not a perfect system. The hymen can rupture for a lot of reasons, right? And so it's not always just because of intercourse, but that is what we tend to talk about with that. And then the perineum, which some of you were wondering about, is this little thin stretch of skin right here. It's very like smooth, very, we would say smooth and sensitive skin. And if you've ever heard of somebody tearing during childbirth, which we won't talk much about, but it's called an episiotomy. It's this area of skin that might tear, right? As the baby's head is coming out, sometimes if it's very large, that little stretch of skin can sometimes tear. It doesn't happen that often anymore. Some of you are like, oh God, that's awful, right? It's not super common anymore, but it definitely can happen. But all of these things are like the external genitalia, right? All of the external genitals or reproductive organs for women. What I want you to do, and I told you we were going to do this, and we'll do this a couple of times in the next couple of classes, with your same group, I want you to think of all the slang terms for vulva or like lower female anatomy that you can. Write them down because I'm hoping you'll share. You feel free to use the internet if you want to like look them up too. But get a good list going, all the slang terms you can come up with for vulva or like lower female anatomy. I'll give you a few minutes, write them down or type them up.
Okay. So here's one that we don't use like in stage, but I think it's been more popular in that specifically. Right. I was put my notes. Alright, Danny, proceed with up that's a big for a particular part. Like one like, you know, Meridian. Ooh. Now I forgot what it was. Oh my God. The JJ. Yeah. I've never run right now, we got family, the hero, really big. What's the name of the country? Good. I'm not feeling so maybe able to use it. Check an urban dictionary. Yeah. Put down huge. Very small. Did you just say sleep phone? Oh, okay. I was like, what? Oh, sorry, I need a second.
It's just a revolve taco. I see it. I've never heard anyone say that. It's very high.
Like, I can even explain to like. Nothing is slang, she's all like, wow. Have you guys ever heard Amber? Yes,
Yeah.
I've heard of the person to come up. Actually, vegan? I've never heard of it.
Wait, is that really what that means?
Pros and benefits.
I love it
Oh,
all.
wow.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm not-
Yes.
I've never heard of that one. Never heard of it. I'm writing it down.
I really do like.
Bro, I respect the crazy. No, I never use that. No, I didn't. Snargle Billion.
Follow pie. Velvet buzzsaw.
What side are you on?
Oh my goodness.
There are an absolute
Dusty
ton.
cellar. They really say
I must have 65 hours.
Yeah.
All right, have you exhausted a lot of you look like you kind of have worn out your list. Anyone want to, anyone willing to read your list? I love it, you're so. So we can hear him, I'm excited. All right, here we go.
Alright, so the first one. We got from Sean from a thing. From Europe, they call it Fanny, it's I guess the whole thing. There's pussy, box, I've never heard of that one. Taint, cunt, gooch, Katie's one. These are the weird ones, you got roast beef, beaver, twat, bearded clam, and pointers.
Excellent, thank you, thank you. And I love the presentation right now. All right, anybody else want to read theirs? Yeah, go, you don't have to stand up.
Okay.
Yeah,
So.
and don't worry if there's overlap, just go for it.
Okay, so this one.
Okay.
Penis fly shop. We have the Velvet Lounge, the Golden Pink Taco, the Whispering Eye, the Honey Pot, Beef Curtains, Hot Dog Holster, Lotus Flower, which I like all of these are all offensive, except some of them are cute.
Okay.
The ham wallet, love that one. The fufu, the cookie, the punani, lady bits, the muff. Hatchet wound.
Hatchet wound, okay, all right. That's a great list, thank you. Anybody else have a list you want to read, even if there's some overlap, it's okay. Anybody else? Anything that we forgot that just needs to be added? I'm just staring at the side of the room just in case, right? Anyone? Okay, all the same, yeah, and then we have a lot of, yeah, go for it, let's do it, why not?
Fanny again. Oh, I read it.
Double. Great, right? Lot of anatomy slang, right? We're gonna do this for male anatomy, so start thinking about it. We're gonna do it for Brett, so start thinking about that. So again, start brainstorming these things right in the back of your mind. But we tend to use an incredible amount of slang rather than the proper terms. We're obviously learning the proper terms today, but very rarely are they used. But why might it be important to know the actual terms for some of these pieces of anatomy? Can you think of a reason? Yeah.
And I heard you guys talking about like the slang over here, but someone had taught their child that it was like their cookie, and then someone else, like that child was like, oh yeah, like my uncle ate my cookie. And I feel like that is so, like, you need to know the
Sure.
proper terms in case something like that happens.
Can you imagine how scarily like open for interpretation that phrase could be, right? If the wrong person heard it. Okay, that's a great point, right? Anybody else? Why else might you really need to know? Can you think of one more reason? Yeah,
Just so you know, when, like, say if you're going to any medical.
Yeah.
area, like, if they're telling you something
Right.
about your body. And they're like, oh, well, you know, you have some crazy disease and blah, blah, blah in this place, and they're like, what is that? Like you,
yeah,
you know, just have a better understanding of your body as far as like medical.
yeah. That's so you're going to the doctor because something's bothering you, right? Maybe you have pain in one of these places or something isn't maybe how it would normally be, and you want to be able to communicate to that to someone or understand what they're communicating to you. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. I think those are all great reasons, right? And so this is one of the things, obviously, we're learning the proper terms. This is something I will test you on when we get to the exam, right? Labeling some of these structures. So make sure you know not only kind of what they're in charge of or what they do, their functions, but also where they are in the anatomy. And you'll have that on the study guide, so don't stress about that for now. But let's talk about some of the internal structures. And interestingly, most of you got these pretty accurate on your images over here, for the most part, really nicely done. So when we look at the internal structures of female anatomy, the first one, and the one that we tend to think of right off the bat with female anatomy, is the vagina, right? It's a muscular canal. Really interesting. The size of the average or typical vaginal canal is 4 inches. Okay, for all of the expectations that we have about male anatomy, the vaginal canal at its like natural resting state, 4 inches long, right? And that's what is kind of the natural like amount to accommodate. Now the vaginal canal is muscular, so it can stretch and obviously accommodate for a much larger like penis or apparatus or whatever it might be. But it's 4 inches, right, on average. And it's a very like filled with a lot of like fibrous tissue, a lot of blood vessels and nerve endings. Obviously, plays a big role in arousal, right? And this where a baby would pass through on the way out during childbirth. So it has a couple of different functions, but plays a big role in sexual activity and then also childbirth. The cervix is the end of the uterus. Plays a huge role in pregnancy. We'll talk a lot about the cervix when we get to the unit on pregnancy, right? And how it dilates, right? And opens up. But this is something that closes off during pregnancy to maintain the environment of the uterus. The uterus plays a big role in fetal development. And orgasm. Right, so the uterus, kind of like the opening up here, the pear-shaped area right in here, right, is where a baby would grow, right, during pregnancy. It also contracts quite a bit during orgasms and during intercourse or any kind of sexual activity for women. The fallopian tubes, you can see on each side, we have 2 of them, right? Fallopian tubes play a big role in fertilization. And we could say like egg transport. Every month, right, a woman releases 1 egg out of their ovaries, right, the last structure that's up here, and it travels down the fallopian tubes to the uterus, right? And so fertilization, right, if a woman is going to become pregnant, egg and sperm actually meet in the fallopian tubes, and that's where that would occur, right? And now sometimes women can have damage to their fallopian tubes, or they can have a lot of scarring, so the egg has a hard time getting there. But for the most part, right, the ovaries will release that egg, it travels down through the fallopian tubes, and that's where fertilization would occur. The ovaries are where our eggs are produced. They play a big role in hormones for women, right? So we see a lot of functions of the ovaries every month. One egg would be matured and released from the ovary, traveling down the fallopian tube and starting that whole cycle, the whole menstrual cycle, which we'll get to in just a minute. Okay, so these are kind of the main internal structures of female anatomy. Oh, I thought there was a question. Any questions, thoughts, comments, anything? Yeah. It can happen for a couple of reasons, right? Some people are just born with scarring. Other people, it can happen as a result of like an STD or an STI. An infection could also cause that. And oftentimes people won't even know. But sometimes when women are having a hard time getting pregnant, it can be because they have scarring or swelling of the fallopian tubes, which prevents that egg from getting down to the uterus. So a couple of things. It's usually like an infection that happens early, or like an STD or STI. Some of them cause that swelling to occur. Did you have a question?
Same question.
Oh, okay. But she read your mind. Anybody else? Other thoughts, questions for now? No? Everybody's favorite topic, menstrual cycles, right? Is where we'll go next. I want you to take just a minute, again, in your group, right? Your slang group, right? Sorry, you're getting your exercise today, right? In your slang group that you had, see if you can come up with any slang terms for the menstrual cycle, right? Like period is a very obvious one. Let's see if you can come up with any more. There aren't as many, so it'd be just like a minute. But write down any slang terms for menstrual cycle that you can come up with as a group.
Never heard that. I've heard that one so many times. Yeah, that's like in this class. So. Okay, this is kind of hard. Red wedding. Real. Actually said that. No, stop. Communist in the White House.
Each
one. Different thing. Mad cow disease. But I don't know if that's real. I don't know if that applies to that. Because mad cow disease is. Oh, this is social.
All right, have you there aren't as many of these, but there's still definitely a few. Yeah, you want to read yours? There's what? In the fun house. Okay. I like that. That's different. What are some other ones that you have? Anyone want to share? Yeah.
We heard one that I thought really weird. Japan is attacking.
Oh, attacking. Okay. What are some other ones that anyone want to read? Their list? What is this? There's communists in the fun house. Oh. Yeah. Oh, okay. For the Red Scare, I've heard that one kind of related to that. Other ones? What else did you? Yeah, go for it.
Bloody Mary, Red Wedding,
Oh,
Mother Nature, Crimson Tide. You already said Japan is attacking.
yeah.
Code Red and Ant Flow.
Okay. Ant Flow, Shark Week.
And ketchup.
I've heard. And what was that?
Ketchup.
Ketchup packet. These are so awful, right? Slang terms, some of them are so gross, right? Like you just try not to overthink them a little bit. There's definitely slang here, right? Again, we'll get to more of it, so keep brainstorming in the back of your mind. But the menstrual cycle, which we often call somebody getting their period, right, is another very common slang term. We're looking at this monthly cycle that women go through, right? And there's a lot of things happening in this cycle, right? There's a lot of hormonal influences. There's 4 different phases that we'll talk about. This plays a really big role in mood and functioning and a lot of behavioral stuff for women. Menstruation comes from 2 words, menses and mene. Right, so we have these 2 words that form the word menstruation. Mene means moon. Right, so based on the word moon, and mensis is month. Right, so it's kind of loosely based off the idea of like the lunar cycle. Right, the lunar cycle is a 29 and a half day cycle. Most women have a 28-day menstrual cycle. Now, it's very common for this to not be regular. Okay, some women are like 28 days, it's completely regular, you can plan it every month. Other women, it's all over the place, and that's completely normal. It's very, very common, but it's based on the idea of like the lunar cycle. Yeah.
I don't even know if you can answer this question, and it's a little off topic, but when I was 15, it's also a little bit of a personal anecdote, but when I was 15, I was diagnosed with anorexia and I lost my period.
Yeah.
Why did that? I
Yeah.
lost it for like so many weeks. Like,
Mhm. Yeah, and that's actually really common as well. When people gain a lot of weight or lose a lot of weight or have any changes in weight, it can affect your hormones. And when it affects your hormones, it affects your menstrual cycle. So sometimes when people are really stressed, or when they have like severe changes in weight, like, so if you lose a lot of weight, it's called amenorrhea as the technical name for it. And women are will commonly lose their menstrual cycle for months at a time if they have big changes in weight. So there is a correlation there with like eating disorders like anorexia or bulimia, or even just big changes in like gaining muscle or losing weight can cause changes in your menstrual cycle. It's actually a very sensitive cycle. It can be thrown off by a lot of things, and weight is a big one because it affects your hormonal influences. It's a great question, actually. Yeah.
Sometimes like women sync up.
Yeah.
Periods. Is there any like scientific explanation for that? Or
Yeah. Yeah, so it's thought to be kind of related to the idea of like pheromones and hormonal influences. Like if you have a big group of women that are together, really interesting. I went off to college and I was in an all-female dorm, and it wasn't uncommon for like half of the women in that dorm at the same time to be menstruating. It almost became like a joke. Like the guys in the dorm next door would be like, yeah, avoid that place for this week, right? Like it was kind of a long-term joke. But some of that has to do with hormones, right? And so what can happen is we all emit like a certain like small degree of what are called pheromones, and it can just cause women to sync up. It's interesting. It can happen within a household or within a bigger like cluster, like a dorm or whatnot. But it does happen, right? Where women will kind of get a similar menstrual cycle. They slowly start migrating toward the same time of the month as each other. Kind of wild. I had another thought with that, but it left me. So menstruation is the name for this whole cycle, or a menstrual cycle. Menarche and menopause, or menarche, I've heard it both ways. Menarche is the first menstrual cycle that a woman gets, right? So when they begin menstruating for the first time, and menopause tends to be when people stop menstruating. So on average, right, with the first menstrual cycle, we're typically looking at somewhere around 11 to 11 and a half years old. Now, this is a huge average, right? It can be much earlier. It can be much later. My daughter, she'd probably die if she knows telling the story. That's okay. She's not here, right? There's 11. My daughter had her first menstrual cycle at 9. And I was like, I have to tell you, like, normally in our household, like, my partner is the one who's like totally cool, level-headed, not me. We were camping, and my daughter went to the bathroom, and she's like, I'm bleeding, something's really wrong. My partner's like, we got to get her to the hospital, like she's dying, something's wrong. I'm like, I don't think that's it. I think it's something else, right? And my partner was like, no, can't be, she's 9. And I'm like, yeah, but she's big for 9. And so my daughter at like 9 and a half got her first menstrual cycle. Didn't get another one for like a year, which was so random. We're like, is it coming back or what happened, right? And that's really common as well. But my daughter's always been much like bigger. And so I expected it. But this can happen anywhere between like 9 to 12. 11 is usually the most common, right? 9 is pretty early. Yeah,
Yeah, I also got like my first period at 9.
yeah, it's
And I
early.
also stopped at like right after, and like took like a while for it to get
Yeah.
regular.
Mhm. And that's something that we don't tend to educate people on a lot, right? That you might get a menstrual cycle and then you might not have another one for months, right? In the beginning, when people are starting this cycle for the first time, very irregular. It's very normal for it to like happen and then not happen, or like be very brief or even really long. It can be all over the place. Yeah.
If someone gets a period like earlier,
Yeah.
will they get menopause earlier, or it just depends?
It depends on the person, right? And sometimes early menopause actually runs in families, right? So that can be a little bit genetic. Like it runs in my partner's family, like they tend to go through menopause in their early 40s rather than like 50s. And so it's more genetic than anything. What you might see is that it could affect like the amount of eggs that you produce. So you might taper off in like your egg production later in life. But not necessarily. There's like a little bit of a correlation, but that doesn't necessarily mean they cause each other. It's a great question. Yeah.
Can a girl get pregnant before she starts menstruating, or is it?
Yeah, it's after, right? And so you actually have to have, and we're going to talk about why. When you have a menstrual cycle, it's because an egg has been released and is traveling down. And so if you don't have a menstrual cycle, there's no egg there, right? And so if there's no egg, there's no chance of getting pregnant. And a lot of people actually use that as a form of birth control, because you can kind of time it that way. So technically, no, but I mean, I want to say the earliest recorded pregnancy was someone who was like 6, or something like that. It was really early, and I don't think it was under good circumstances. But yeah, you really have to have this process going. You might not have like an obvious period, but if this isn't happening, then there's no egg there to fertilize. Yeah. So you technically, like, you have to ovulate in order to have this, but the egg doesn't necessarily have to make it to the uterus to count, if that makes sense. So when the egg is released, it triggers all these different hormones in the lining of the uterus, which is what's shed to grow, proliferate. But that egg might not ever get down to the uterus depending on a lot of factors. So you can't necessarily get pregnant without this whole process, like happening. Running. Any other questions for the moment? Yeah, I have a little overview video, and then let's talk about these different phases that are happening. Let me play this for you. Back. But let's talk about what's going on in each one of these phases. Again, an incredible amount of hormonal influences and changes happening in a woman's body during each one of these. But there's 4 main phases that occur. And again, we're assuming kind of a typical 28-day cycle, but for a lot of women, as I mentioned, it might be more or less, or it could change every single month. There's a lot of apps that you can use to like track this that will kind of take guesses at where you're at in your cycle or when it's coming. And if you're very regular, that's easy to do. And if you're not, it might be a little more challenging. The first phase, right from days 1 to 6, is the menstrual phase. And in the menstrual phase, what's happening is this is when a woman is actively bleeding. They're having their menstrual cycle, or bleeding or period, or all the slang terms that you just mentioned. That endometrium, which is the lining of the uterus, is being shed, right? And that's what is bleeding right out of a woman's body. It's that lining of the uterus, which is called the endometrium. This lining will support an egg if it's fertilized, right, and allow pregnancy to be maintained and happen. But if pregnancy hasn't happened, right, that's what the body then sheds and releases for roughly like 4, 5, 6 days, depending on the woman. Some is much shorter, like 3 days. Others can be a little longer. On average, like 4 to 5 days for like the most of that first phase, right? That menstrual phase of that cycle. So that's when that lining is being shed or being released. And this happens on a cycle over and over and over again, right? So like from here, we go back and we'd start over, right? Just keeps going round and round and round until the woman stops menstruating during menopause. In phase 2, we have what's called the follicular phase. follicle means egg, right? And once we're talking about a follicle here would be an egg that's developing. So in this phase, what we have is that the egg is maturing for release. So during this second phase, what happens is we have all of these different like hormones that are released within the body, right, that cause that egg that's already been developed, right, and sitting in the ovary to mature and be ready to be released. So we have things like FSH and estrogen and luteinizing hormone and a bunch of different hormones that cause that egg to mature. And also in this stage is building back up that lining of the uterus again. Right, it's been completely shed, right, as part of that menstrual cycle. And so as that egg starts to mature for release, we also get a little bit of that lining starting to build up again in preparation for the next egg that's going to be released. Again, kind of constantly occurring. And then in the third phase, right here around day 13 or 14, we get ovulation. And this is when the egg is actually released from the ovary. And when a woman ovulates, they have a really big surge of a hormone called LH, or luteinizing hormone. And as I mentioned before, you can detect that with a test, right? So if you're trying to track when you're ovulating, a woman would urinate on a little stick that tests for the hormone LH, and it'll tell you when you have that surge just before that egg is going to be released. So around day 13 to 14 of this cycle, the lining is starting to build up, the egg has been released, right? And so then we move into the next phase, but really interesting, you can use this knowledge to help you in a couple of ways. During this whole period of time right here, your chances of getting pregnant are next to zero. Why would they be next to zero? We mentioned this just a second ago. How come that it would be very difficult to get pregnant? Yeah, right, there's no egg, right? So a lot of people will use that as like a form of natural birth control. Right. And so maybe there tends to be a lot of taboo about having sex during the menstrual cycle, which there's no harm to, right? That's just a personal preference. But during days like 6 to maybe 14, there is almost no chance of getting pregnant. Right. And so a lot of people, again, use that as like a natural birth control method. On the flip side of that, right here is where you are most likely to get pregnant. So sometimes we call this area right here the fertile window. It's like days like 16 and 17, right? It takes a couple of days for that egg to come out and start going down the fallopian tube. But if a couple is trying to get pregnant, they would have sex right here after they've ovulated because there's an egg traveling down the fallopian tube, and you're most likely to get pregnant here. So people can use that to avoid intercourse here, or maybe have it in the hopes of getting pregnant. Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Is it the safest and after 10 it's like okay.
Yeah.
Live to live for a window.
So it's technically true, right? But it takes them a little bit of time to get up there. And the longer that they've been in the body, the more of them do die off, unfortunately. But it sounds so mean to say, but right, they die off. Millions would be like entering the body and only one makes it to the egg. So technically, the closer you get to this, the more at risk you would be. So yeah, I think it would be a safe bet to say up to like day 12. And again, this is assuming that you have a normal 28-day cycle. If you're irregular, it can make it much harder to use as like a natural birth control method. But yeah, the closer you get to this, the more risk you would have, for sure, definitely. And then at the end of it, again, you're going to be clear again, because that egg is gone and is no longer in that window of being able to be fertilized. So you can use that knowledge in a couple of ways, but yeah, you do have to kind of be careful, especially if you don't have, like a regular 28-day cycle. The last phase, the luteal phase, is right here. And this is named because there's a thing that develops called the corpus luteum. And they showed that to you in the little video. It's this like solid body that forms in the ovary. And what it does is it releases and produces hormones that maintain the endometrium, right? So it causes the lining of the uterus to build. Because it's assuming that a fertilized egg is on its way, right? And so that corpus luteum will break down if no pregnancy occurs. And that's what then causes us to go back here and have the lining be shed for those first days. And then the egg starts to mature and be released and lining built up, and then around and round and round we go. So if a woman gets pregnant, that corpus luteum maintains itself. And that's what keeps that lining of the uterus maintained so that pregnancy can continue. And again, round and round and round and round and round, right until menopause, when this tends to stop, right? When that egg supply has been depleted and women don't have regular cycles anymore, and it causes a bunch of hormonal changes to occur. Now, because there are so many hormones happening, a lot of women experience PMS, premenstrual syndrome, right? All sorts of different hormonal things that can occur. This can be as mild as like cravings for things or being a little more emotional, maybe a little bit irritability. I don't think I shared it with this class, but I think it was my abnormal psych class. My dad used to tell us when we were kids that your mom was going to be somebody else for 1 week out of the month. Like, and it scared us as kids. We were like, what do you mean somebody else? So like, just don't look your mom in the eye for 1 week out of the month. We're like, why is she going to turn into a monster? I remember being so scared as a kid, and it turned out it was just this. Like, my mom had really bad, like, hormonal influences with her cycle. But this can occur like 2 days before to up to 12 days before. And for some women, this can be so severe that we actually call it premenstrual dysphoric disorder, or PMDD. Very common to have some mild symptoms, some people more than others, and some months more than others. But for some women, this can actually escalate to like clinical levels of depression and all sorts of like behavioral things that might require medication or treatment in order to help them manage it. Not super common, but PMS, very, very common. Right? A lot of women do experience that. See some of you nodding. Any comments or thoughts or anything here? Anything PMS related? Yeah.
When I'm PMSing, it
Mhm.
always feels like 2 weeks before.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tell because I start crying with every week.
Yeah.
And yeah, it just happens in advance, so not like the week before. It's just
Yeah.
always I know it's gonna come to.
And it's interesting, like you said, you start to learn that about yourself, right? Like, okay, I'm crying over nothing. I'm 2 weeks out, right? And for some women, I'm crying over nothing. I must be a day or two out, right? It can be kind of all over the place. For some people, it even happens after instead of before, right? So it's learning like your own cycles in a way, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's so weird. I want my pain right. I started having horrible cramps where I'm having to sit down.
Yeah. And some women have awful cramps and some have none, right? And it's your uterus like contracting to get rid of that lining, right? Is what's causing those cramps. And for some, it can be really painful. And for others, nothing, right?
Birth control,
Yeah.
but then that made me like so depressed.
Mhm.
But I had to get off of this and then
Yeah.
I had to, like get back used to like being just a whole thing.
Yeah, and birth control can be really helpful for some people in regulating a lot of this and helping people be like regular and controlling hormones. And for others, the side effects are way too much. It's not uncommon either. There are some like antidepressants that are sometimes used to help people who have intense symptoms of like PMS or PMDD, especially around that time of the month. Yeah.
So that helps your body like prepare for pregnancy, right?
Mhm.
So how does progesterone birth control work?
So progesterone is in charge of maintaining the lining of the uterus. And so if you have progesterone going, that lining stays. And when the progesterone levels fall, that it's released, right? And so when you take a birth control pill that alters progesterone, it's making the lining so thin that an egg wouldn't be able to implant into it. Or sometimes kind of forcing a cycle to happen at certain times to prevent pregnancy from occurring. Yeah.
One thing I always heard is one way to somewhat like alleviate the physical pain of cramps is a heat pack, like
Yeah.
on your lower stomach.
Yeah.
Can you explain why?
Yeah, so heat, right, or sometimes cold, right, can reduce swelling or inflammation. And sometimes for some women, when they're having cramps, like they get bloated and inflamed. And so the heat can help reduce that a little bit, not much different than if you had like an injury or like an exerted part of your body. So it's either reducing the swelling or bloating that can happen there. Yeah.
Or if they take like.
Yeah.
Skip it.
Yes. Yeah, so if you take, when you have birth control pills, there's like the 1 week of like the sugar pills or the placebo pills. If you wanted to skip a cycle, you just keep taking the active pills. And so what happens is those pills don't contain anything in them. And so you have this drop off of all of the hormones, which then causes you to have a menstrual cycle. So if you keep taking them, it basically starts you over and you skip the menstrual cycle part of it. And there's no harm in doing that periodically, right? It's kind of an interesting amount of control that you can have when you take birth control pills. If you're like, I have plans this weekend, or it doesn't work out for me this weekend, I can skip that. And then you can just pick up again the next month. It's dangerous to do that all the time, like to keep skipping for long periods of time. That can cause hormonal changes, but periodically it's thought to be fairly safe to do. Any other questions? Yeah.
I don't know, I totally get PMS and like, most every girl gets it.
Yeah.
It kind of sucks, but I have like a love-hate relationship with it, I guess, just because I've heard so many, I guess, older women like blame their bad behavior on PMS.
Sure.
And it's like really upsetting to me because I feel like when people are actually trying to tell other people like, okay, like I'm, this is what's happening to me.
Sure.
It's out of my control, it's my hormones, but I'm gonna do my best to try and level it out, whatever. People don't take it the same way because they're so used to other people just like being a bad person, being like, oh, I'm PMSing, like I can control it. Like, oh, it's like, no, you can, you're just like deciding to kind of go into it, I guess. But I don't know, I just feel like I have a little love-hate relationship with it because I'm like, I want to let people know, I guess, that like certain people in my life, that's like, hey, I'm just a little bit wonky right now, but other people use it for speaking.
Yeah, like a scapegoat, right? It can be frustrating at times, for sure.
Like trying to this is happening, you know what I mean? I feel like it just makes it a little less believable that PMS is actually a thing.
Yeah, oh, for sure. There's a ton of stigma around it, and like it's often thrown at people too. Well, it must be that time of the month for you, right? Comments like that, which is kind of insulting, right? And some women control it better than others. Some use it as a scapegoat and some don't. So I don't blame you for having a love-hate thing with it. There's definitely that present, right? Did you have a thought on that too? Or? Sure. Right. Yeah. Yeah, and that happens a lot, right? I'm sure a lot of you have had either heard that or had that thrown at you or thrown it at someone, maybe even like it. It's very common to say things along those lines. Yeah.
I remember with terrible endometriosis. She ended up getting pregnant on purpose at 19 because she was in so much pain each month. And so people that are just double over, can't get out of bed.
Right.
And of course they're going to be bumping.
Yeah, it's a huge spectrum. There are a lot of women who don't experience any PMS symptoms at all. And there are women who experience them but don't acknowledge it. There are women who use it, right? And even use it as a scapegoat. So it's definitely all over the place. And again, it can be so severe that people can have things like endometriosis or like PMDD and require treatment, right? Because it can be so uncomfortable and painful or cause clinical levels of depression or anxiety. So it is a massive spectrum and definitely a love-hate thing, I think, on both sides, right? Whether you're having one or have people in your life who are having a menstrual cycle. I'll stop here for today since we only have a minute left, and I'll leave this if you needed to take an image of it or a picture of it or anything. Thank you for your beautiful drawings. We will keep going with chapter 5 and then probably start chapter 6 as well when I see you on Wednesday. If you didn't bring your markers back, bring those back for me too. That'd be great.